greeting you again in Jesus' name. This is the second part of a very crucial point in our study of mercy, as we've been following it through the Old Testament and into the New. And our subject for this half hour will be Matthew chapter 12. As I mentioned in the last session, I did everything that was asked of us to do when I was reading these studies through. And so at the top of chapter 22 of what the Bible teaches about mercy here, which I have in front of me, he writes, this study is about the will of God being mercy. And then he says, pray, study this chapter, that's Matthew 12 now, pray, study this chapter through at least 4 times. Well, with my background and the way I was as a person, I figured if I read something once, I've got it. I had that mindset. I didn't like to read anything twice. I said, I've read it. I've got it. So it was a bit of a put down to me. I have to read this 4 times? But because I had consecrated to do that, whatever it said, I was going to do it, and I knew I needed to learn. I had no idea that, as I've often said, that I had learning disability when it came to spiritual things. I thought I was a pretty good student in secular things, but in spiritual things I found out I was learning disabled. But I said to myself, well, he says to read it through 4 times, Matthew 12, all of it. There's 50 verses, I think, in Matthew 12. And yes, 50 verses. And so I plunged ahead and I read it through 4 times. And the more I read, the more convicted I was. I said, I don't know Jesus very well. This matter of him commanding in Matthew 9, it was a commandment to the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. The knowledge of God, more than burnt offering. The more I plunged into that, the more I realized I need this. I need this. I might be a slow learner, but I'm going to get it. I'm determined. I want to know Jesus the way he really is. So I read it through 4 times, and of course I've read it hundreds of times since then. But I'm going to read this opening section, verses 1 through 8, because they are so stunning, especially if you think of yourself as being a religious person. I've done well, God is happy with me, I'm righteous. Oh, I'll say more about that when I finish reading it. But let's look at what it says in Matthew 12 and verses 1 through 8. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, or the through meaning there is a field of wheat, grain. And his disciples were an hungered and began to pluck the heads of the wheat, the grain, and to eat. They rub it, and then they ate the wheat seed, the wheat kernels. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, and remember, we always contrast how the Pharisees thought with how Jesus thought. The Pharisees were always ready to criticize somebody, always ready to judge. They were the bearers of the standard of righteousness, but they didn't know God. So they said, behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. But he said to them, Jesus, now just take this in. Have you never read what David did when he was a hungered? And they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, he had told them to go learn it. But if you had known what this means, I will have mercy, loving kindness, chesed, and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath day. I can't do for you what I just said I did, and I hope that you will be as willing to do what I did, and that is to read through all of Matthew 12 4 times, as he calls it, pray study, talk to Jesus as you're reading. The Lord showed me many years ago, talk to me. I am the inspiration behind this. I'm the subject. I know everything that happened. I can explain everything. Talk to me while you read. I hope you're willing to do that, because this chapter is, it's almost like marching into the mercy seat, the Holy of Holies, where the mercy seat was, the most sacred spot in all of Israel. And there was no light in there except the glory of God. And staring at that mercy seat and realizing nobody was allowed to go in there except once a year. And that you had to have sprinkling blood, had to sprinkle blood on it in order to approach God like that. This chapter takes you right into the Holy of Holies. Only now, the temple of God is Jesus, and his heart is the mercy seat, and it was his blood that was sprinkled there, and the only reason you can go in there and not die is because he tore the veil to the Holy of Holies and let you come in there and look there into his own heart, which was a mercy seat. And in there, if you'll go with him in there, he will turn your inside world into a mercy seat. But as I said, it's a fire. It burns. It's almost as though the Lord has said to you in this chapter, I want you to participate with me in what Isaiah experienced in Isaiah 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Do you remember that passage? His train filled the temple. The glory of God was there. The pillars of the temple shook. And he had an experience there that changed him forever. And a live coal came off of the altar and onto his tongue and affected his whole life. If you will take Matthew 12 seriously and what's taught here, it will be like a live coal coming into your own mouth and into your own heart. And you will say like Isaiah, woe is me, I am undone. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, and I'm undone. I'm trying to express to you that God has an experience for you in reading Matthew 12 that will affect you very deeply. Here's the heart of it as I see it now, and which it took me a long time to swallow this, because Jesus is superior, I want to say to you, but he's superior to your beliefs, and they had beliefs, the Pharisees, in three major portions of their religious life: the Sabbath day, the temple, and the sacrifices. And they considered themselves the rulers of the synagogue and the enforcers of those three things: the Sabbath day, the temple, the sacrifices. You may not know how much of a religious spirit you have until the words of Jesus that he spoke to them go into your own heart. I'm going to say it the best way I know how. He threw it in their faces when he said to them, God allowed David and his soldiers, his caretakers that surrounded him when he was running from Saul, he allowed them to eat something, and then he used the words, which was not lawful for them to eat. He threw that in their face. It wasn't lawful. Oh my. When you're a law keeper, and that's everything to you, excuse me, how do you deal with the words, not lawful for them to eat? Until you see that Jesus didn't primarily come to be an enforcer of the law, but a fulfiller of the law. And by the end of this chapter, that sinks into you. Jesus came to fulfill the law, and all the law is fulfilled in one word, Paul said, even in this: thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's no different than saying, I need to live constantly in the loving kindness will of God toward other people. At this point, it might be wise to define what I mean by the will of God. What I mean is God's will for man in relation to himself, and God's will for man among men. That's what it means. It's very simple. How do I treat God? What is the greatest of all commandments? Love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is similar. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law is fulfilled like that. So when David came and he was desperately hungry, he was running from Saul with his men, and there was nothing to eat except the showbread, God treated David with mercy. Rather than let them starve and go hungry, he said, I will allow you this once to eat what is not lawful, because I'm going to meet your need. Oh my, have I been challenged on this many times. Oh brother, you're describing a slippery slope. You're going to allow anything. No, no, no. Mercy is a stricter rule to live by than anything in the law. It's harder to live in mercy in the daily life toward other people than it is to keep the laws of the Sabbath, the temple, and the sacrifices. I want to talk for a minute now about that. There's such a contrast that we need to absorb between the old covenant and the new covenant. The old covenant was, if you obey, you will be blessed. If you don't obey, you will be cursed. Paul understood all that, and he described it as sin had to be shown to be exceeding sinful. There was no law given that could make a man righteous. Righteousness doesn't come by the law. I'm quoting Paul in all these things. And in the words of the Apostle John, the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. He was the fulfilling of it. When you follow him, something arises that makes you realize the law was there for a schoolmaster. That's Paul's word in Galatians. To bring us where? To Christ. The Pharisees couldn't see Jesus for who he was. Do you see Jesus for who he is? These are matters of supreme importance, and I'm going to read a paragraph now from chapter 22 that discusses this. This has got to be into our understanding. We must press it home to you here. This is from page 1 of the chapter 22 on mercy. We must press it home to you here, the supreme importance of the things which the Bible itself makes of supreme importance. If the Bible itself makes this matter, I will mercy, to be supremely important, then it is no one's private doctrine to point out what the Bible emphasizes as being supremely important. It's not even our teaching which makes this subject of supreme importance. Our teaching seeks to show what the Bible itself, God's Word, says and teaches about the supreme importance of this subject. The Bible has its own ways of emphasizing certain truths. In these two studies, in Matthew 9 and Matthew 12, we have from Jesus' own mouth an emphasis as great as anything in the whole Bible. You may find yourself arguing with that, but my experience is you would be wise not to fight that. You would be wise to open yourself up to, it could be that this is more important than I realized. I won't take the time. If you get a copy of the studies on mercy, you can spend a good deal of your time in this chapter 22. And there's an awful lot in this chapter about the immense importance of the Sabbath day in the Jewish mind and heart. Sabbath day, Jesus was constantly healing people and doing things on the Sabbath day, which irritated the Pharisees terribly. In this case, in Matthew 12, all it was the disciples were hungry. They went through a field and they rubbed the grains of wheat in their hands and ate them. And the Pharisees, that was work. That was work. That's forbidden on the Sabbath. This is an immense thing, the Sabbath day, still is in the mind of Orthodox Jews. The Sabbath is holy. The temple was holy. That location, and we've let that carry over to the building that we call the church. The church has never been a building. The church is people that belong to God. But I remember when I was as a boy, I wanted to run everywhere. And I ran in the church building, and my mother would say, "You can't run in church, you can't run in church." And I remember thinking, is this building really that holy? Is the building holy? Well, in the Jewish mind, the temple was the holiest place there was. This is huge. Sacred. The temple. And then you had the sacrifices, and everything was focused on the priest properly making a sacrifice for sin, and only the priest could pronounce you clean and all of that. Those three things were huge, and I was saying, you can take the time to look at this more carefully in this chapter on Matthew 12, which is chapter 22 in the mercy studies. But Jesus was saying, and you'll find it at the end of, towards the end of Matthew 12, Jesus says there's somebody greater here. Oh, I'm sorry, it's verse 6, yes. In this place is one greater than the temple. One greater than the temple. And you have one greater than the Sabbath. He was the Sabbath. He is, according to Hebrews, God's rest that we all need to come into. He is. Jesus is. It's not the day, it's Jesus is the rest of God. Come into me. Come, take my yoke upon you. Learn of me. You will find rest unto your souls. That's the real Sabbath. He's greater than the Sabbath. He's greater than the temple. He's greater than the sacrifices. And as I was saying at the end of the chapter, verse 42, he says, and a greater than Solomon is here. And I have taken the time to study about Solomon's kingdom and how great it was. And it was so breathtaking that the Queen of Sheba, when she came to see Solomon's kingdom, said there was no spirit left in her. She said, the half hasn't been told. It's way more than I thought it was. And Jesus is greater. Here's the crux of it. Here's what I'm saying now. Jesus is the will of God. And if I say in the same sentence, Jesus is the mercy of God, it's the same thing. You need, and I need, to learn this. What Jesus said and did is superior to any kind of religious ceremonies, places, activities, procedures. Nothing is as sacred as Jesus himself. I wonder if you get that. I wonder if I get it sometimes. Different times the Lord has said to me, you know, no matter who you're talking to, no matter what you're looking at, no matter what you're thinking, I see it. And I love you. And I want nothing but the best for you. And if you would turn to me more often, you would understand how I think. You would know what my will is, and you would be able to do it better if you would look at me and not think that all these little religious things that you do, ceremonies, we all have them, are little righteous procedures. If you would look at me more and all those other things less, you would come into a knowledge of me, and you would understand how I thought all my days on earth as I moved through society, the uppers and the lowers. As I moved through it, you would understand how I think. That's what Matthew 12 has done for me. I'm putting it in a nutshell. Jesus is greater than the Sabbath. Greater, he is the temple of God. He's greater than all the sacrifices. He is the supreme sacrifice. And he is the Sabbath. You need to know him as he is. And this chapter concludes with one of the most, I don't like cliches, but I have to use a cliche in this one. At the end of this chapter, he says one of the most mind-boggling things you'll ever think about. You know, at the end of the chapter, his family came trying to talk to him. And there was such a crowd around him as he spoke that his family could not get through, his mother, his brothers. And someone said to him in verse 47, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to speak with you." He answered and said to them that told him, he said, "Who is my mother? And who are my brothers?" In the other gospel it says, "And who are my sisters?" He stretched forth his hand toward his disciples, and he said, "Behold my mother and my brothers. For whoever will do the will of my Father, which is in heaven, the same is my mother, my brother, my sister, my mother." That's mind-boggling. We can never be his Father, but we can give birth to him inside. We are his natural, actual brothers, his natural sisters, if we simply do what he's taught. My will is mercy. I want loving kindness everywhere. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, and you will find it corresponds to loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Hi, I'm Doug Dietert, and I'm holding in my hand the book on which all of my lessons on mercy were based. It's called What the Bible Teaches About Mercy. And I'd love for you to have a copy if you'd like one. You can write to me at doug@evergreencenterinc.org, and we'll arrange for you to get a copy. That's doug@evergreencenterinc.org.